Her father's hand opened over the table and 2 coins hit the wood. Not thrown, not placed, just dropped. The way you drop something you are finished with. Jake Morrison counted them with 1 finger without picking them up. $2. He nodded. Thomas Miller nodded back. Neither man looked at Sarah. She was standing 3 feet away. She had been standing there the entire time. They negotiated her life the way men negotiate the price of a tired mule. And when it was done, Morrison finally turned to her and said pleasantly, "Go get your things. If this story is already in your chest, subscribe right now, hit that bell, and ride this all the way to the end with me. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Sarah's story travels. Let's go." Sarah Miller had been awake since before 4, same as every morning, because sleep in that cabin had always been a negotiation with the heat pressing down through the roof boards, with the mice working the wall seams, and with the deep, persistent ache in her left leg that woke her every time she lay still too long. The leg had been wrong since birth. Not in a way that twisted or deformed, just wrong in the hip socket and the knee, both so that every step she took cost more than it cost other people. 25 years of that cost. She had never known a single morning without it. She was at the wood stove when her father came through the curtain. Thomas Miller moved like a man who had been broken and badly reassembled. The height was still there, the broad shoulders, the hands that had once been a working man's pride, but everything hung wrong now, loose and heavy like the frame had given up on holding itself together. He stopped when he saw her and stood there blinking in the early dark. "There anything left?" he said. "Yes, sir." She was already fixing his bowl. He sat. He ate. She watched him from the edge of her vision, the way she always did cataloging. The jaw, the angle of the shoulders, the speed of the spoon. Her father angry was one kind of morning. Her father planning something was another, and this was the second kind. She had learned to read the difference the way some people learn to read weather. He finished and pushed the bowl toward the center of the table. "Sit down, Sarah." She sat. Her leg throbbed when she shifted positions quickly, and she pressed her palm against her knee without thinking, the old automatic habit of managing it quietly, keeping it invisible, giving no one a reason to use the word. Cripple. She had heard it her whole life in every possible register. Pitying, mocking, casual. Her father had said it about her to other men the way you might describe a broken tool, not with cruelty, exactly, just with that particular flatness that comes from having already decided something doesn't fully count. "I've been talking to a man," Thomas said. He was looking at his hands. "Name of Morrison. He runs an employment house down in Beckley. Women working there, cooking, cleaning, keeping the place running." Still not looking at her. "He came through 2 weeks back looking for workers. I told him I might know someone." The air in the room changed. Sarah felt it before she understood it. "You mean me?" she said. "Work's work. You ain't pulling enough here. The garden's dying, and I ain't got a shift till fall if the foreman keeps his word, which he don't usually." He finally looked up. "Morrison says you'd get a room and meals and a wage." "What kind of establishment?" "The working kind." "I don't know anything about running a—" "You know how to cook," he said. Flat, final. The whole inventory of her in 5 words. "You know how to clean." She looked at her father's face for a long moment. Looked for something to hold on to. Found nothing she could use. "When would I go?" "He's coming back through today. Around noon." He gave her that. 8 hours. The whole shape of what remained of her life in that cabin, 8 hours of it. And then he stood up and went back through the curtain, and she heard the creak of the cot as he lay back down. She went outside, and she worked. That was the only thing she knew to do with dread. Put it somewhere physical, move it into her hands and her back, and let labor carry it. She went down the rows of the kitchen garden on her knees because kneeling was easier than crouching, pulling pigweed and clover from around the pole beans that were fighting the dry summer ground for every inch of life they had. She hauled water from the creek twice. She swept the cabin floor while her father slept. She thought about Beckley. She'd been there twice, once at 12 for a doctor's appointment, once at 15 for her aunt's funeral. Both times, she'd watched the town from a truck window, real sidewalks and storefronts, and people moving with the particular purposefulness of people who have places to be. She had tried watching them to imagine being one of them. She had not quite managed it. Employment house, women working, cooking and cleaning. There was something wrong in those words, and she knew it. Had known it from the first moment her father said them. But the not wrong she could not quite shape into language. It lived in the stomach, not the head, and she had spent 25 years learning not to trust what lived in her stomach over what a man told her with his mouth. He was a bad man in many ways, but he was still her father. And there was a part of her, the part that had not yet been finished off, that needed to believe a father would not do the very worst thing. She was still believing it when Morrison's truck came down the road at 12:15, and she saw the man who stepped out of it and understood in the first 3 seconds that she had been wrong. Jake Morrison was smooth in the way of men who have never done real work, pressed shirt in that heat, which alone told you everything about how he saw himself. Soft hands. A smile that arrived on his face, a half-second before anything behind his eyes engaged with it. He walked toward her with his thumbs in his belt, and he looked at her the way she had been looked at her whole life, the full up-and-down assessment, the pause at the leg, the barely visible recalibration downward, the revision of expectation. She had seen that look so many times, she could have drawn it from memory. "This is her," he said, to Thomas, as though she weren't standing 4 feet away. "That's Sarah," Thomas said. "How old?" 25. Morrison tilted his head, studying. "That leg she get around all right." "She manages fine," Sarah said. Both men turned. Morrison with mild surprise, the way you might look at furniture that had shifted on its own. Thomas with a quick hard warning in his eyes that she absorbed and held and ignored. "She works hard," Thomas said, stepping slightly forward, recovering the conversation. "Does everything needs doing?" Morrison looked at Sarah for another moment, not at her face, at her, the whole of her measuring, and then he nodded, once the nod of a man who has revised his price accordingly, and he reached into his shirt pocket. What he said on the tailgate of his truck made a sound so small it should not have meant anything. 2 coins. Dropped on metal. $2. "That's what I offered," Morrison said to Thomas. Not to Sarah, to Thomas. And Thomas Miller, her father, the man who had held her as an infant, who had carried her on his shoulders once when she was 4 and her leg was hurting and the walk home was too long, who had been present in the room when her mother pressed those last words into her ear. Thomas Miller looked at those 2 coins. He looked at them for a long time, and then he picked them up. Sarah watched his fingers close and felt something in her chest complete its long collapse. Not breaking things had been cracking there for years, since her mother got sick, since the drinking got worse, since she had understood slowly, and then all at once what kind of man grief had made of him. But this was different. This was the wall giving way entirely, all at once. No drama, just done. "Daddy," she said. He didn't look at her. "Daddy?" Her voice was steady. She needed it steady. "Look at me." He looked. And there it was, not the nothing she had feared, but something worse than nothing. She could see that he knew what he was doing. She could see the knowledge of it sitting in his face like a stone he was trying to hold under water. He looked at her for 1 full second. 1 second, where he could have said anything, could have put the coins back, could have told Morrison to get off his land. And then he looked away. His fist closed, his jaw set. And that was the last thing her father ever gave her. 1 second, then nothing. "You'll want to get your things," Morrison said to her pleasantly, as though they had just concluded a perfectly ordinary piece of business. She went inside. She stood in the middle of the cabin's single room, and she breathed, in and out, slow. She had learned a long time ago that if you stood still and breathed slow enough, the worst moments eventually became the next moment, and the next moment was always slightly more survivable than the one before it. She stood, and she breathed until her hands stopped wanting to shake. Then she took her mother's shawl off the nail by the door. She rolled it carefully, the way her mother had taught her, fold over fold, keeping it tight and even. She pressed it against her chest for a moment, with both arms wrapped around it. Her mother's smell had been gone from it for 3 years. She breathed in the memory of it anyway. The idea of it. June Miller, who had loved her without condition in a world that attached conditions to everything, who had saved up her last real breath to put those words somewhere safe. You are not what they say you are. You hear me, Sarah June. You are not what any of them say. She was not going to cry. Crying was for people who believed crying would change something. She took her cloth bag from under the cot change of clothes, her mother's Bible with the cracked spine, a comb, the photograph she kept folded inside the Bible of herself and her mother at the creek, when Sarah was about 7. Both of them laughing at something outside the frame, and she slung it over her shoulder, and she walked back out. Morrison was already at his truck. Thomas had moved to the porch and stood with his back to the road to her, to all of it. Daddy. Just his name. No question. No accusation. Just the sound of the word placed in the air one final time, because she needed to know she had said it. He did not turn around. She walked to Morrison's truck. Her leg rolled and ached with every step the way it always did, and she kept her back straight and her chin level, and she did not hurry, and she did not slow down. She opened the passenger door herself. She got in. She set her bag on her lap, and she held her mother's shawl against her ribs with one arm, and she looked straight ahead through the windshield at the road leading out of Render Hollow. Morrison got in, started the engine, pulled out. She did not look back at the cabin. She had decided that in the 30 seconds between the porch and the truck, she would not look back. Not once. The road was dirt for the first 4 miles, then gravel, then eventually paved, and as the surface changed beneath her, she felt the hollow releasing her. The way a fist releases something it has held so long it has forgotten it was holding. Her whole life had been inside those mountains. She had never once thought of leaving. And now she was leaving in the worst possible way, in a stranger's truck purchased with $2 of her father's debt and shame. And still underneath the fear, underneath the collapse of the morning, there was something she did not expect. She was still here, still breathing, still holding the shawl. Morrison talked for most of the drive. His voice was practiced and pleasant, the voice of a man who had learned that pleasantness keeps people from asking the questions they ought to ask. He talked about the establishment, about the arrangements, about how well things worked for everyone when everyone did their part. She let his words move past her without catching on anything. She was busy doing what she had always done when she was afraid paying attention, watching his hands on the wheel, noting when he checked the mirror, learning the grammar of him. She would need every piece of information she could collect. She understood that now clearly and completely and without sentimentality. She was in a bad place being taken to a worse one. She had no money, no legal standing, no one who knew where she was. She had a shawl and a Bible and a photograph and a mother's voice she kept somewhere behind her sternum like a coal that would not go out. It was not enough. She knew that. But it was what she had, and she had spent 25 years learning what to do with not enough. In Beckley, Morrison turned down a side street she didn't know and pulled up in front of a building wider than it was tall, painted sign above the door reading Morrison Employment and Boarding. Women welcome flower boxes under the windows with geraniums blooming red in the summer heat. She stared at those flowers for a moment. Real flowers. Tended. The particular kind of detail a man uses to make something look like what it isn't, and the fact that he'd bothered the fact that he'd planted actual flowers told her exactly how much he needed people not to look too closely. He led her inside. The smell hit her first something sweet, and something underneath it that the sweet was working very hard to cover. A front desk. A woman behind it who looked up and ran the same quick assessment on Sarah that Morrison had run outside, though this woman's eyes did something different with what they found. Not judgment, something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of one person in a trap seeing another person being walked into the same one. "This is Ruth," Morrison said. "She'll get you settled." And he turned and walked to his office and closed the door, and just like that, she was property that had been delivered and filed. Ruth came around the desk. She was maybe 40, built solid, with quick eyes that moved like they were always counting exits. She extended her hand. Sarah shook it, studied her face, decided not to decide yet. "You come far?" Ruth asked. Render hollow. You eat today? This morning. Ruth nodded, started down the hallway. Sarah followed her bag on her shoulder, her leg marking every step on the close-laid floorboards. Ruth walked slightly slower than she needed to, which Sarah noticed, which was a thing you did when you were being considerate of someone without wanting to make them feel considered. That was a careful person. A person used to navigating other people's fragility. How'd you come to be here? Ruth asked. Voice dropped, eyes ahead. Sarah thought about the tailgate, the coins, her father's fist. My father made an arrangement, she said. Ruth made a sound, not quite a word, just a sound low and knowing. A lot of the girls, she said quietly, come something like that way. Then she stopped at a door at the end of the hall, put her hand on the knob, turned to look at Sarah directly for the first time. Really look. And in her face was a warning, careful and quick, the kind of warning that can't be spoken out loud in a place like this, but comes through clearly anyway, through the eyes, through the set of the mouth, through the way she held the door handle without yet turning it. There are rules here, Ruth said, neutral, factual. Morrison explains them himself usually tonight. You'll want to listen carefully. A pause. Just long enough. All the way through. You understand? Sarah looked at her. Yes, ma'am, she said. I understand. Ruth opened the door. The room was small and held a cot, a washstand, a single window with a curtain pulled. Sarah walked in. Ruth set a hand briefly on her arm, just a touch, just a second, and then pulled the door shut from outside, and Sarah was alone. She sat on the edge of the cot. The shawl was still in her hands. She looked at the curtained window, and she thought about what Ruth's warning meant, about what Morrison's rules would sound like tonight, about the locked quality of the front door she had noted when they came in, the way the other women she'd passed in the hallway had moved heads down. Quiet, practiced in a specific kind of quiet that is different from ordinary quiet, that is the quiet of women who have learned exactly what happens when they are not. $2. That was what she was. She looked down at her mother's shawl in her hands. She pressed it once hard between both palms. You are not what they say you are. She pulled in one slow breath, then another. Her eyes moved to the window, to the door, to the washstand, to the gap beneath the door where light and sound came through from the hallway. She was already counting, already mapping, already looking for every crack in every wall of this place, because that was who she was. That was what 25 years of surviving on not enough had built inside her, something Morrison had not thought to assess when he looked her over on that tailgate and decided she was worth exactly $2. He had not looked at her eyes. That was his first mistake. Sarah Miller pressed her spine against the wall, pulled her knees up, wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders, and she began quietly, methodically, with the full force of an intelligence that had never once been given credit for existing to plan. She did not sleep that first night. She lay on the cot with her mother's shawl pulled across her chest, and she listened. That was what she did with the dark, when she couldn't use it for anything else. She turned it into information. Footsteps in the hallway told her how many people moved at night and in which direction. Voices through the wall told her which rooms were occupied and by whom. The particular creak of the front door told her when it opened and when it was locked, and it was locked at 10 o'clock by the sound of a bolt she hadn't seen when she came in. Heavy and deliberate, the sound of a man who understood that the real function of a lock is not to keep people out, but to keep people in. She filed all of it. By the time gray light came under the curtain, she had a map in her head, not a complete one, but a working one. 6 rooms on this hallway. At least 4 occupied. One woman who coughed through the wall on her left, soft and persistent, the kind of cough that had been there a long time. Footsteps that passed her door twice after midnight, slow and checking, which meant someone made rounds. The kitchen was at the far end. She'd smelled coffee before 5, which meant someone was up cooking before the house woke, which meant there was a schedule, and schedules were rules, and rules were walls, and walls had gaps if you knew where to press. She was dressed and sitting on the edge of the cot when the knock came. "Breakfast in 10 minutes, a voice said through the door. young, flat, reciting. "Thank you," Sarah said. She folded the shawl and placed it at the head of the cot, smoothed it once with both hands, and stood up. The hallway had 4 women in it when she stepped out, all moving in the same direction, none of them looking at each other with the particular practiced non-looking of people who have learned that eye contact invites conversation, and conversation invites questions, and questions, in a place like this, are not safe things to have. Sarah moved with them. She looked at each face without being obvious about it. Noted ages 1, maybe 18, one closer to her own 2, she couldn't place. Noted the way they held themselves. Noted who walked fast and who walked careful. The kitchen was long and plain, a table running its center with benches on both sides, and Ruth was at the stove. She didn't turn when they filed in, but she said, "Sit," and they sat, and within 2 minutes she had plates in front of all of them. Eggs, toast, coffee, and the efficiency of it told Sarah that Ruth had done this 10,000 times. That this was a woman running a machine she hadn't built and didn't own. Sarah sat across from the youngest one. Girl was maybe 17 on a good day, with the kind of face that had recently been pretty and was now working very hard to disappear. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly. The girl glanced up, glanced down. "Dottie?" she said, barely sound. "How long you been here, Dottie?" Dottie's eyes cut sideways, not at Sarah at the door, at the hallway beyond the door, then back to her plate. 4 months, she said even quieter. "You from around here?" "Morgantown." Sarah nodded. She ate a bite of eggs, let the silence settle so it didn't feel like interrogation. Then, casual, like asking about the weather. "What kind of work do they have us doing?" Dottie's fork stopped moving. She didn't answer. She picked up her coffee cup with both hands and looked into it, and Sarah watched the girl's shoulders come up slightly, the physical grammar of a person pulling back from a question that frightened them. And in that single movement, Sarah understood more about this place than anything Morrison had said in the truck yesterday. She did not push. She looked at her own plate, and she ate. Ruth set a hand on Sarah's shoulder when she came around to collect the plates just for a second. Just pressure, no words, and then she moved on, and Sarah filed that too. Morrison came for her at 9. He knocked on the open kitchen door with his knuckle 2 sharp raps, and smiled when she looked up. "Sarah, good morning. Ready to talk?" She followed him to his office, which was at the front of the building, and she sat across the desk from him in the chair he indicated, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at him, and she waited, because she had learned that waiting made men reveal more than questions did. His office was neat. Ledger books on the shelf behind him, rows of them, same size, same color. The kind of organization that means someone is tracking things carefully. A safe in the corner, which she noted. A telephone on the desk, which meant he had a line, which meant connection to the outside, that she did not. "Let me explain how things work here," Morrison said, settling back. "The women in this house are here because they owe a debt. Transportation, room and board, the initial arrangement fee." He paused. "In your case, there are additional costs. Your father had some obligations I absorbed as part of our agreement." Sarah kept her face still. "What obligations?" "Nothing you need to worry about the particulars of. What matters is that you have a balance, and the way you work it down is by contributing to the house." He opened the ledger on his desk and turned it toward her, and she looked at the column of numbers. He indicated her name at the top, written in already, and beneath it, a figure that made her stomach drop clean through the chair. $87.50. "That's what you owe," he said pleasantly. "Board is $1.50 a week, deducted. Your wage is 50 cents a week, so you're working down the balance at $1 a week net." Sarah did the arithmetic before he finished the sentence. 87 weeks, a year and 8 months. She looked at the ledger, and then she looked at him, and she said very carefully, "What was the arrangement fee, the initial one? Standard fee for placement?" He turned the ledger back. $2. She held his gaze. "The same $2 my father received." Morrison smiled. "Your father was compensated for his cooperation, yes. So the $2 went from you to him and then back to you as my debt." The smile stayed exactly where it was. Didn't grow. Didn't shrink. Just held the way a mask holds when the person behind it decides not to react. That's one way to look at bookkeeping, he said. The other way is that you have a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, and a clear path to settling your obligations. He stood, which meant the conversation was over. Ruth will show you your duties. You'll find it's a fair house when people do their part. He walked her to the door and held it open, and she went through it, and the click of it closing behind her was the most precise sound she had ever heard in her life. She stood in the hallway for 5 seconds, 10, breathing through her nose. $87, $1 a week. A debt built from the same $2 that had purchased her in the first place, recycled into a cage so neat it had its own ledger page, she thought. He has done this before. Many times. The books are too organized for this to be new. She thought, there are other names in that ledger. She thought, there is a law somewhere that covers this. There has to be. She didn't know the law, not yet. But she knew how to learn things, and she knew how to wait, and she knew with the specific bone-deep certainty of a woman who has survived 25 years on nothing but her own careful mind, that Morrison had made the same mistake her father had made, and her teachers had made, and every person who had ever looked at her rolling walk, and her round body, and her quiet manner, and seen something diminished. He had not looked at her eyes. Ruth found her in the hallway 30 seconds later and put her to work. The work itself was not the problem. Cooking, she knew. Cleaning, she knew. The labor of the house was hard, but it was honest in a way that nothing else in the building was, and Sarah moved through it with the steady efficiency of someone who has never had the luxury of doing things slowly. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her knees, which was easier for her leg, and she didn't apologize for it or explain it when the other women glanced at her. She carried laundry in stages, rather than in one heavy load, 2 trips where another woman might make one, and she did it without comment, without asking for accommodation, without giving Morrison or anyone else a reason to put a number next to her limitations in their heads. But she was watching. Every minute, every room she was sent into. She counted the women. 6 total, including herself and Ruth. Dottie from Morgantown, the persistent cough through the wall, whose name turned out to be Clara. A tall, quiet woman named Vera, who moved like someone braced for impact at all times, and a 5th she hadn't spoken to yet, who sat in the far corner of every room she occupied and looked at the middle distance with an expression that had passed through fear and come out the other side into something flatter and harder to name. By the afternoon of the second day, she knew this none of them believed they could leave. Not because the door was always locked, it wasn't during the day, but because Morrison had built something more effective than a locked door. He had built debt. He had built the arithmetic of it, the visible ledger, confirmed arithmetic of obligation that grew faster than it shrank, and he had built it so neatly and so completely that the women inside it had stopped seeing the walls and started seeing only the numbers. That was the real lock. Not the bolt she'd heard at 10 o'clock. The numbers. On the 3rd day, Vera spoke to her. They were hanging laundry in the back, one of the few outdoor tasks morning air still cool before the heat settled in, and Vera worked beside her in silence for a long time before she said without looking up from the sheet she was pinning, "You're counting things." Sarah pinned her corner. "I beg your pardon. You're always counting something, watching the doors, timing when Ruth goes to the front." Vera still wasn't looking at her. "I used to do that, when I first came." "How long ago was that?" A pause. 14 months. Sarah looked at her then. Really looked. Vera was maybe 30 or had been 30 recently before something had aged her forward, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who had made peace, or the thing that looks like peace, when hope has been revised down far enough. "Your balance," Sarah said quietly. "Is it going down?" Vera's hands kept moving. Pin, pull, smooth. "It goes down $2 some weeks," she said. "Then Morrison adds a fee. Laundry fee. Wear and tear. Doctor visit when Clara got sick last winter, he charged us all a portion of it." Pin, pull, smooth. "It doesn't really go down. Has anyone ever paid it off fully?" Vera looked at her then. Her eyes were steady and dark, and said everything her voice wouldn't. "No," she said. No one I ever heard of. Sarah went back to the sheets. Her hands kept working. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, turning over what she now understood, not guessed understood, about the system Morrison had constructed. It was elegant in the terrible way that cruel things are sometimes elegant, self-perpetuating, self-justifying, documented in neat columns in a locked ledger on a locked shelf in a locked man's office. She was still turning it over that evening when she heard the commotion outside. She was in the kitchen washing the supper dishes. Ruth beside her drying when a voice came through the side wall of the building. Morrison's voice raised in the particular way of a man who is not accustomed to being made to explain himself. None of your concern what goes on in a private business establishment. Another voice, low. She couldn't make out the words, just the register of it, not loud, not competing with Morrison's volume, but solid in a way that made Morrison's anger sound thin. The way a stone wall sounds solid against someone hitting it. Ruth stopped drying. She looked at the wall. Her face did something careful. What is that? Sarah asked. Ruth shook her head. Not, I don't know. More like, not now. More like don't. Sarah dried her hands and moved toward the side window. Not the front. The side where she could hear without being seen, and she listened. Morrison was doing most of the talking, which meant the other man was making him talk, and a man who makes another man explain himself without raising his own voice is a man who doesn't need volume to have authority. She pressed closer to the wall. Ruth made a small warning sound. She ignored it. These women are here by their own choice and under lawful contract. The low voice said something, short, factual. Morrison again, faster now, which meant the other voice had landed something. I have documentation. I have signed agreements. I run a legal boarding house. The low voice again. Still short, still not competing. And this time, through the wall, through the wood and plaster, Sarah caught one word clearly. Sheriff. She pulled back from the wall. Her heart was doing something it hadn't done in 3 days. Moving fast, moving with something that was not yet hope, but was shaped like the space where hope might fit. Ruth was looking at her from across the kitchen with the expression of a woman who has seen things like this before and knows how they usually end. Who is that? Sarah asked. Ruth folded the dish towel. Set it down precisely. His name is Bear Hawkins, she said. He comes through Beckley maybe twice a year. Keeps to himself mostly. She paused. Morrison doesn't like him. Why? Ruth looked at the wall at the muffled argument still going on outside it. Because, she said slowly, Bear Hawkins is the kind of man who notices things Morrison would rather not have noticed. Outside, Morrison's voice cut off mid-sentence. There was a silence. Then Morrison said something shorter, quieter, the tone of a man making a temporary strategic retreat, while telling himself it's something else. Then footsteps. Morrison's footsteps, she had learned those two going around the side of the building toward the back. Sarah moved before she thought about it. She went down the hallway and out the side door, the one they used for laundry, and she came around the corner of the building and stopped. He was standing in the narrow space between the Morrison building and the dry goods store next door. And he was big in the way that certain men are big. Not the swollen big of excess, but the settled big of a body that has done real things for a long time and kept the record of it in the frame. He was somewhere in his 40s, with a face that had been weathered into something honest. Not pretty, not gentle-looking, but the kind of face you read as true, the same way you read certain wood grain as true, because it shows you exactly what it is. He wore plain clothes, no affectation, and he had a hat in his hand that he'd clearly removed when he was talking to Morrison, which was a thing a man did when he wanted to make clear he was being deliberate and not careless. He turned when she came around the corner, and he looked at her, and he did not do the thing. He did not run the assessment. He did not find the leg and recalibrate. He looked at her face directly the way you look at a person, and he waited. You were arguing with Morrison, Sarah said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out because it was the most relevant true thing. I was asking Morrison some questions, the man said. He didn't care for them. His voice was the same in person as through the wall, low, unhurried, with a West Virginia flatness under it that meant he was from here or near here or somewhere like here. "You live in there?" "I was brought here 3 days ago," she said. "By arrangement." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not pity, which he would have stepped back from, but recognition. The specific recognition of a man who understands immediately what brought here by arrangement means in the context of a building like this one. "What's your name?" he said. "Sarah Miller." "Bear Hawkins." He didn't extend his hand, which she appreciated. He read the situation well enough to know that a handshake in the side alley of Morrison's establishment was not a neutral gesture. "How old are you, Miss Miller, if you don't mind?" 25. "You come willingly." It was a direct question, and she gave it a direct answer. "My father sold me for $2. Morrison called it an arrangement fee and added it to a debt he says I owe him. The debt is $87.50. It earns faster than I can work it down." She said it plain, the way she had practiced saying it in her head since the morning Morrison showed her the ledger. No inflection, no bid for sympathy, just the facts in the order that made them clearest. Bear Hawkins was quiet for a moment. He looked at the side of the building, then back at her. "That debt," he said. "He's got it in a book, a ledger, on a shelf in his office. And all the other women in their same system. 6 of us. Vera has been here 14 months. Her balance hasn't gone down." He put his hat back on his head. He did it slowly, with the deliberateness of a man making a decision while he performs a simple action. He looked at the front of the building. He looked at her. "I'm going to come back," he said. "I need to make some inquiries first. Talk to some people." He paused. "I need you to not do anything that gives Morrison a reason to move you before I do." Sarah looked at him steadily. "I've been surviving things my whole life, Mr. Hawkins. I know how to be patient." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, something quieter than a smile, but related to one. Respect, maybe. The real kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. "I reckon you do," he said. He walked back toward the street. She stood in the alley and watched him go, and she felt the thing that had been shaped like the space where hope might fit, fill in just slightly, just enough to breathe against. She went back inside before Morrison came looking. Ruth was where she'd left her in the kitchen, and she looked up when Sarah came through the door and said nothing. Just looked, and Sarah said nothing either, and they finished the dishes in silence. But it was a different silence than the one before. Heavier, with something that both of them were holding carefully. The way you hold something fragile in both hands and don't speak while you're carrying it. Because speaking uses the same attention that keeping your grip does. That night, Sarah lay on the cot and did not sleep again. But this time, the wakefulness had a different quality. She was still listening, still mapping, still filing every creak and footstep and bolted sound. But underneath the listening, there was something new, the image of a man putting his hat back on his head with the deliberateness of a decision. The sound of a voice that had made Morrison speak faster. The word sheriff dropped clean and simple into an argument like a stone into still water. Bear Hawkins had said he would come back. She believed him. She couldn't have explained in the logical sequential terms she normally used to evaluate information exactly why she believed him. He was a stranger. She had spoken to him for 4 minutes in an alley. Everything she knew about men who made promises to women in difficult situations pointed strongly toward not believing them. But there was something in the way he had listened. Not the listening people do while they wait for their turn to speak, and not the listening of men who are collecting what a woman says in order to use it for their own purposes later. He had listened the way people listen when they are genuinely trying to understand something, when the information matters to them, not as leverage, but as truth. She pressed her mother's shawl against her chest in the dark. 4 minutes in an alley. One man, one word sheriff through a wall. Not enough. She knew that. She had always known how to work with not enough. She closed her eyes, and she ran through the ledger in her head, the numbers she had memorized in Morrison's office, the columns the way the additions worked, the language he had used. Arrangement fee, board and keep, wear and tear. The legal shape of what he was doing, and the places where that shape had to be pressing against something, some law, some federal statute, some line that even 1954 West Virginia drew somewhere. There had to be a line. She just needed to find it before Bear Hawkins came back, so that when he did, she was not just a woman in a bad situation asking for help. She was a woman with information, with evidence, with the specific documented ledger-confirmed shape of the crime that Morrison was so confident no one would ever name. She opened her eyes in the dark. She thought about Dottie, 17 years old, who couldn't look up from her coffee cup. She thought about Vera, 14 months in, working a debt that grew while she slept. She thought about Clara, coughing through the wall, and the woman in the corner, whose name she still didn't know. And Ruth, who warned her on the first day with her eyes and her hand on a door handle, and a careful sentence about listening to the rules all the way through. She thought about her mother's voice. "You are not what they say you are." No, Sarah thought. I am not. And neither are they. She pulled the shawl tighter, and she lay in the dark of Morrison's building, and she began to build piece by careful piece the argument that was going to bring the whole thing down. She found the name on the fourth day. It wasn't in Morrison's office, she hadn't gotten back in there, and she wasn't going to try, not yet, not without a reason Morrison would accept as ordinary. It was in the kitchen of all places in the back of the drawer where Ruth kept the household accounts. A folded paper, old edges soft from handling, tucked under a stack of supply receipts. Sarah found it while she was reorganizing the drawer, a task Ruth had assigned her, legitimate, unsuspicious, and she unfolded it with her back to the door and read it in the time it took her heart to beat 4 times. It was a letter, dated 8 months ago, from a man named Gerald Coombs, County Attorney, Raleigh County. It referenced an inquiry into Morrison employment and boarding. It used the phrase "practices inconsistent with lawful labor arrangement." It asked Morrison to appear for a voluntary interview. Voluntary, which meant Morrison had been able to say no, which meant he had said no, which meant Gerald Coombs had the beginning of something and had not been able to finish it. She refolded the paper exactly as she'd found it. Put it back under the receipts in the precise position she'd lifted it from. Closed the drawer. Her hands were steady. Her mind was running fast. Gerald Coombs, County Attorney. 8 months ago, someone had already started pulling at this thread. Someone had a file with Morrison's name on it sitting in a county office 12 miles away. And Morrison was still operating, which meant the file was incomplete, which meant it needed something it didn't have. Evidence. Specific, documented, named evidence. She had names. She had numbers. She had a ledger she'd memorized in 4 minutes in Morrison's office. She had Vera's 14 months, and Dottie's 4, and Clara's cough, and the woman in the corner whose name she'd learned that morning was Pauline, and who had been here 22 months, and whose balance, according to what Vera whispered over the laundry line, had not moved in 6. What she didn't have was a way to get that information to Gerald Coombs without Morrison knowing she'd done it. What she needed was Bear Hawkins to come back. He came back on the 6th day. She knew it before she saw him because of Morrison's voice, that particular raised quality, that thin-over solid quality, that meant someone was making him explain himself again. She was in the hallway when she heard it, and she felt every muscle in her body orient toward the sound the way a compass needle orients north, immediate and without deliberation. Ruth caught her arm before she could move toward the door. "Not yet," Ruth said under her breath. "Wait." "Why?" "Because if Morrison sees you go to him, he'll move you tonight. He's done it before." Ruth's grip on her arm was firm. "Wait until he leaves, and then I'll tell you where he's staying." Sarah looked at her. "You know where he stays." Ruth's face did the complicated thing it sometimes did, the thing that was 3 or 4 emotions moving through the same space at the same time. "Bear Hawkins has been trying to build a case against this place for 2 years, she said quietly. "He came here the first time because of a girl named Annie Pruitt, 16 years old, came from Logan County. She's gone now. Morrison moved her before anything could be done." Ruth released her arm. "He's not just passing through Sarah. He's been working on this a long time. The information reorganized everything. Bear Hawkins wasn't a stranger who had happened to notice something. He was a man with a 2-year history, a specific name he was trying to get justice for, and a case that had stayed incomplete for the same reason Gerald Coombs's case had stayed incomplete. No one on the inside willing or able to give him what he needed. Until now, she waited. The argument outside ran another 10 minutes, she counted, and then Morrison's footsteps came inside, quick and irritated, and she heard his office door close hard enough to say everything his voice wasn't saying in that moment. Ruth moved to the front window and watched, and then nodded once at Sarah and said, "Rutherford Hotel, room 6. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon working with the specific, focused calm of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. She washed dishes, she helped Clara fold linens, she ate supper without tasting it, and listened to the table conversation, and contributed just enough to it to seem present, to seem ordinary, to give Morrison's careful watching eyes nothing to find. Because Morrison was watching. She had felt it since the argument outside. A new quality of attention turned in her direction, not accusatory, but assessing the look of a man who is recalibrating. She had been here 6 days and had been quiet and compliant and shown him nothing. But she had also gone out the side door the night Bear Hawkins first appeared, and Morrison had come around the back of the building 2 minutes later, and she had been coming back in when he rounded the corner, and the look he'd given her had been brief and smooth, and told her nothing, and told her everything. He was not sure about her yet. She needed him to stay not sure. After supper, she helped Ruth with the kitchen, and when the others had gone to their rooms, she stood at the sink with her hands in the wash water and said without turning, "I need 1 hour, tonight, after the bolt." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "The bolt goes at 10. He checks rooms at 10:30. That's 30 minutes. The window in the laundry room doesn't latch all the way. It hasn't latched in 6 months. Morrison knows and hasn't fixed it because he doesn't think any of us know." Ruth set down the dish she was drying. "You'd have to go out that way and come back the same way. If you're not back before 10:30, "I'll be back," Sarah said. "If you're not, I will be." She turned and looked at Ruth directly. "I found the letter from Gerald Coombs." Ruth went very still. "In the drawer," Sarah said. "8 months ago. He had something and he didn't have enough." She held Ruth's gaze. "I have enough. I have all of it names. Balances the structure of the debt system, the recycled arrangement fee. I have 22 months of Pauline and 14 of Vera, and I have it in my head clear as print." She paused. "But I can't get it to the right people without Bear Hawkins, so I need tonight." Ruth looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Sarah began to count the seconds the way she counted everything, marking the distance between where they were and wherever Ruth was going to land. "Laundry room window," Ruth said finally. 10 o'clock. Be back by 10:25. Sarah turned back to the dishes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ruth said, and her voice had something in it that was old and tired and not unkind. "Just don't get caught." The Rutherford Hotel was 4 blocks from Morrison's building, and Sarah covered it in just under 8 minutes, which was fast for her leg on an uneven sidewalk in the dark. And she didn't think about the pain. She just moved, counting blocks, watching the street, staying close to the storefronts, where the shadow was thicker. The town was quiet at this hour, a few lit windows, a distant radio, no one who looked at her twice. Room 6 was at the top of the stairs. She knocked twice, quiet. The door opened in under 10 seconds, which meant he'd been awake, and Bear Hawkins looked at her in the dim hallway light with an expression that moved quickly from surprise to understanding to something focused and alert. "Miss Miller," he said. "Come in." He had a small table and 2 chairs, and he gestured to one, and she sat, and he sat across from her, and she did not waste the time she didn't have. "Gerald Coombs," she said. "County attorney. He had a case 8 months ago and it wasn't complete. I know what it was missing." Bear went very still in the way she'd noticed he went still, not frozen, but concentrated, everything coming to a point. "How do you know about Coombs?" "I found his letter. Morrison kept it." She folded her hands on the table. The debt system, the way Morrison structures it, a recycled arrangement fee, charged back as the woman's debt board assessed at a rate higher than the wage additional fees added to prevent any real reduction in the balance. I have it all in my head. Numbers, names, how long each woman has been there, the approximate balance Morrison claims each one owes. Bear reached for the notepad on the table beside him. Tell me, she told him. All of it. Precise in order, the way she had organized it in her head over 6 nights of not sleeping. Vera, 14 months, approximate balance, still over $60, despite consistent work. Pauline, 22 months, balance, unmoved in 6. Dottie, 4 months, already restructured once, with a fee addition. Morrison called a settling cost. Clara, medical costs, redistributed across all residents without consent. Her own balance, $87.50, built from the same $2 that had been paid to her father, a circular transaction so neat it was almost audacious. Bear wrote, and she talked, and the room was quiet, except for the scratch of the pencil, and outside the window the occasional sound of the town settling into its night. When she finished, he set the pencil down and looked at what he'd written, and then he looked at her. "How'd you hold all of that?" he said, not disbelief, genuine. "I've been holding things my whole life," she said. "I'm good at it." He looked at her for a moment with that quiet reading expression. Then he said, "There's a federal statute. The Mann Act has provisions, and there are labor code violations here that go beyond state jurisdiction. Coombs was working state channels. If I take this federal—" He stopped, reorganized. "How long do you have tonight?" 22 minutes now. He stood, moved to the small desk against the wall, and opened a leather case she hadn't noticed, and pulled out a document several pages folded. He brought it to the table and unfolded it, and she saw that it was a legal form, dense with type, with blank spaces throughout it. "This is a federal complaint affidavit. If you sign this with your name, your account of conditions, the financial information you just gave me, it goes to the Federal Labor Office in Charleston, not to Morrison's county contacts, not to anyone local." He put his finger on the signature line. "It also means your name is on a federal document. Morrison will eventually know." "I know. It could make things harder before they get easier." "Mr. Hawkins." She looked at him steadily. "I have been hard my whole life. I know how to be harder." Something moved in his face. He sat back down across from her and slid the document toward her and picked up the pencil and held it out. She took it. She read every word first, every line. He waited without impatience, without shuffling or sighing, and she appreciated that more than she could have said. A man who waited while she read, who did not assume she would sign without understanding, who did not fill the silence with reassurances, meant to hurry her through the comprehension she was entitled to. It took 4 minutes. She signed. He took the document back, folded it carefully, placed it in a separate section of the leather case. "I'm driving to Charleston tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll file this personally. Coombs gets a copy. Federal involvement will reopen his case." He paused. "Realistically, Sarah, can I call you Sarah?" "Yes. Realistically, this takes time. A week, maybe 2, before any official action. You need to stay in place, stay compliant, give Morrison no reason to move you or the others before this comes together." He looked at her seriously. "Can you do that?" "I've been doing it for 6 days without knowing there was a plan," she said. "Yes." He nodded, then quieter. "Your father, do you want—" "No," she said. Clean and immediate. "Whatever he owes for what he did, that's between him and whatever comes for him. I don't want his name in this." Bear looked at her for a moment. He didn't push. "All right," he said. She stood, picked up her bag, moved to the door, and had her hand on the knob when he said Sarah. She turned. "What you just did," he said, "took more courage than most people will ever have to call on in their lives." He said it plainly, without decoration. Not a compliment exactly, a fact stated the way he seemed to state all facts directly and without performance. "I want you to know I understand what it cost." She looked at him. She felt the words land somewhere real. somewhere, that had not had anything land in a very long time, and she held them there, held them steady, because if she let them move, she would feel the full weight of everything. The past 6 days had been, and she needed to be steady for 11 more minutes and a 4-block walk in the dark. 20 minutes, she said. And she went out. She was back through the laundry room window with 3 minutes to spare. She lay on the cot, and she breathed, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the leather case going into a truck tomorrow morning and driving north toward Charleston, and about a federal office receiving a document with her name on it, and Vera's name, and Dottie's name, and Pauline's name, all the names, all the numbers, all the careful, terrible arithmetic of what Morrison had built. She thought about Annie Pruitt, 16 from Logan County, gone before anything could be done. She thought about how long Bear Hawkins had been carrying that name, that failure, that incompleteness, and she thought that she understood something about that, about carrying something you couldn't put down because putting it down meant the wrong people won. She pulled the shawl up, closed her eyes. Down the hall, Morrison's footsteps passed her door at 10:30 exactly, paused for just a second, moved on. She counted to 30 after the footsteps faded. Then she let herself exhale all the way. 1 week, maybe 2. She could do 2 weeks standing on her worst day. The week that followed had a different texture than the first 6 days, not easier but purposeful in a way that changed how the time moved. Sarah worked and watched and said nothing, and she carried the knowledge of the signed affidavit, the way she carried everything important inside tight where no one could reach it. She watched Morrison's face every morning for signs that something had shifted, that he'd received word of something, that his contacts in the county had flagged something. She found nothing. He moved through his days with the smooth confidence of a man who had been doing something wrong for a long time without consequence, and had concluded that consequence was not coming. That confidence was going to be his undoing, and he didn't know it yet, and Sarah found to her own surprise that she felt something almost like pity for him. Not mercy, not forgiveness, just the distant clinical pity you feel for a person who has built their whole life on a floor that is about to give way and has no idea. Almost like pity. Not quite. On the 9th day, 2 things happened. The first, Dottie came to her room. It was after supper, the hour when Morrison was usually in his office with his accounts, and the women had the loose, unwatched time of the early evening to themselves. Dottie knocked on her door, small tentative knock, the knock of someone who has practiced not taking up space, and Sarah opened it, and Dottie stood there with something in her face that was past the careful blankness she usually wore. "Can I come in?" "Yes." Sarah stepped back. Dottie came in and sat on the edge of the cot and wrapped her arms around herself and said without preamble, "I need to know if there's a way out." Sarah looked at her. 17 years old. 4 months in. The specific fragile quality of someone who has been holding themselves together by the thinnest possible thread and has come to the end of pretending the thread is thicker than it is. "Why now?" Sarah asked. Not suspicious, just needing to know what had changed. Dottie's jaw moved. "Morrison added $40 to my balance yesterday. Said I broke something in the kitchen, a pot lid. It was cracked when I got here." Her voice stayed flat, but her eyes didn't. $40 for a pot lid, Sarah. I've been here 4 months. I'm going backward." Sarah sat down beside her. She did not reach for her hand. Dottie was the kind of person who flinched from touch. Right now, she'd noticed that. She sat close enough to be present and said, "I need you to trust me for a little while longer. Can you do that?" Dottie looked at her. "Is something happening?" "Something is happening," Sarah said. "I can't tell you the details yet, but I need you to do one thing for me. Write down every fee Morrison has added to your balance, dates if you remember them, amounts, what reason he gave. Keep it under your mattress." Dottie stared at her. "Why?" "Because it's evidence," Sarah said. "And evidence is the only thing that is going to matter when the time comes." Something shifted in Dottie's face. The thread didn't thicken exactly. It was still the same thread, but she seemed to find a different grip on it. She nodded once. She stood. She went to the door and stopped. "The woman who was here before you," she said quietly. Before your room was your room. Her name was Annie. Sarah felt the back of her neck go cold. I know, she said. Dottie nodded. Like that confirmed something. Like that was the thing she needed to know before she could trust the rest of it. Then she went out and closed the door softly behind her. The second thing that happened on the 9th day was Morrison. He came to her after supper himself, which he hadn't done since the first morning, and he knocked on her open kitchen door the same way he had that first day. Two Knuckle Rap's pleasant smile arriving before anything else and said, Sarah, walk with me a minute. She dried her hands. She walked with him. He took her to the small sitting room at the front of the building, a room that was technically for residents, but which had the quality of a room that only one person actually used, with his preferred chair, positioned with a clear view of both the front door and the hallway. He gestured to the chair across from his. She sat. He sat. How are you finding things? He said. Conversational. Easy. Fine, she said. The work is manageable. Good. Good. He looked at his hands briefly, then at her. I want to be straightforward with you, Sarah. I think you're a smart woman. She held his gaze, said nothing. Smart women sometimes get ideas, he said. Still pleasant, still easy. About their situations, about options they might have. He paused just long enough. I want to make sure you understand something. The arrangement you're in, it's a legal contract. Your signature, or in your case your father's authorized signature, is on the original agreement. Any attempt to breach that agreement to involve outside parties to make claims about this establishment to any one county federal, anyone would result in your balance being immediately increased. Significantly. He leaned forward just slightly. And I would be forced to make arrangements for you somewhere less comfortable than this. There are other establishments, not as well run as mine. He smiled. It was the same smile as always, the one that arrived before his eyes engaged. She looked at him. She let 4 seconds pass, which was long enough to feel deliberate, without being long enough to feel defiant. Then she said, I appreciate you being straightforward, Mr. Morrison. Of course. I'm not interested in causing trouble, she said. I'm here to work my balance down and move on, that's all. He studied her. She held perfectly still under the studying and kept her face in the particular arrangement she had perfected over 25 years. Compliant, quiet, readable as exactly what a man like Morrison expected to see. Not too much fear, which would seem performative. Not too little, which would seem defiant. Just the right amount of a woman who has accepted her situation and is making the practical best of it. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. Good, he said and stood, and that was that. She went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the sink, and she breathed through her nose, and she thought, he knows something. Not specifics. But he's felt something shift. He is not sure what or where, which means he hasn't heard from his county contacts yet, which means Bear Hawkins is moving faster than Morrison's network. She thought I have maybe 3 days before he gets more certain. She thought 3 days. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went down the hallway to her room, and she sat on the cot, and she held her mother's shawl in her hands, and she looked at the door, and she made herself slow her breathing all the way down, all the way to the bottom, the way you breathe when you need your mind clearest. Ruth appeared in the doorway 10 minutes later. She didn't knock. She came in and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her and stood near it, and her face had the look of someone who has heard something she cannot unknow. One of the county men came to see Morrison this afternoon, Ruth said, while you were in the laundry. Sarah looked up. Which county man? I don't know his name, but I know what Morrison's face looked like when they were done talking. Ruth's voice was careful and low. He scared Sarah. I've worked for this man for 3 years, and I have never seen him scared before today. Sarah felt her heart move. Did he say anything? Do anything? He made 2 telephone calls after. I couldn't hear to who. Ruth looked at her directly. Whatever you set in motion, it's moving. But he's going to do something. I can feel it. He's going to do something before it reaches him. Sarah stood up from the cot. She looked at the window, at the door, at the wall between her room and Clara's, where the coughing had been worse today, and at the ceiling, and at the cloth bag under the cot with her mother's Bible in it. She looked at all of it, and she thought about Pauline in the corner for 22 months, and Dottie writing down dates under her mattress, and Bear Hawkins driving north on a mountain road with a leather case on the seat beside him. She thought about Annie Pruitt, 16 years old from Logan County. Not this time, she thought. She turned to Ruth. How many of the women will move if we tell them to? Ruth blinked. What? If something happens in the next 2 days, if Morrison tries to relocate anyone, how many of them will move fast if I tell them it's time? Ruth stared at her for a long moment with the expression of someone hearing something they have been waiting to hear for longer than they should have had to wait. Then she said quietly, and with something that sounded like relief finally getting out after years of being held in, all of them. Every single one. Sarah nodded. She sat back down on the cot. She picked up the shawl. She pressed it once between her palms. Then we wait, she said. But we stay ready. She didn't sleep at all that night. Not the productive wakefulness of the first nights when she'd been building her map of the place and filing every sound into usable information. This was different. This was the wakefulness of someone sitting at the edge of something, feeling the ground shift underneath without being able to see what was shifting or how fast. Ruth's words kept moving through her. He's scared. I've never seen him scared before today. And underneath those words, the ones that mattered most. He's going to do something. She knew what men like Morrison did when they got scared. They didn't retreat. They consolidated. They moved assets before anyone could freeze them, reorganized the pieces of what they'd built into arrangements that were harder to see and harder to reach. She had watched her father do a smaller version of the same thing every time the mining company threatened layoffs, drinking faster, spending what little they had before it could be taken, burning the present to stay ahead of the future. Morrison had 6 women and a ledger full of fraudulent debt. Those were his assets. And a man who sensed the law coming for him did not leave his assets sitting in plain sight. She was dressed before 4, sitting on the edge of the cot with her mother's shawl across her shoulders and her cloth bag packed and sitting beside her feet, because she had decided somewhere in the night that she was not going to be caught unprepared again. She had been unprepared the morning her father sat her down and told her about the arrangement, and that unpreparedness had cost her everything. She was not giving Morrison the same advantage. At 5:15, she heard it. A truck. Not Ruth's supply delivery that came Thursdays, and this was Wednesday, and besides, Ruth's delivery came at 7 and announced itself with the particular rattle of the same vehicle every week. This was a different engine, heavier. It stopped at the back of the building and idled. Sarah was at her door in 4 seconds. The hallway was dark and empty, and she moved down it toward the back, toward the laundry room, staying close to the wall where the boards were less likely to speak. She reached the laundry room door and eased it open and put her eye to the gap between the door and the frame and looked through the back window. 2 men she didn't recognize, standing at the back of a truck with the bed cover up, talking to Morrison, who was still in his shirt sleeves, his suspenders hanging loose, which meant he hadn't planned this for today. Something had moved the timeline forward overnight. The 3 of them were talking fast and quiet, and Morrison kept looking toward the building, toward the back door, and his face in the pre-dawn gray had the specific compressed quality of a man managing panic by turning it into logistics. She went back down the hallway. Knocked on Ruth's door. 3 times quiet and fast. Ruth opened it in seconds. She had been awake too. "Truck out back," Sarah said. 2 men, Morrison in his shirt sleeves. Ruth's face confirmed what Sarah already knew. He's moving someone. Or all of us. Ruth grabbed her arm and pulled her inside and closed the door. "I have a telephone number," Ruth said low and fast. "Bear Hawkins gave it to me 2 years ago. A contact at the Federal Labor Office in Charleston who could receive emergency information." She crossed to the washstand and lifted the ceramic base, and there was a folded paper underneath it, small and tight. "I've never used it. I didn't have enough to give them." "Use it now," Sarah said. "Tell them Morrison is moving to relocate residents. Tell them the affidavit has already been filed. Bear Hawkins filed it 4 days ago. Tell them if they don't move today, there won't be anyone here to testify to anything." Ruth stared at her. "The telephone is in Morrison's office." "Is there one anywhere else in the building?" No. They looked at each other. 3 seconds of complete silence, in which both of them understood the problem exactly, and neither of them had a solution, and both of them were going to have to find one anyway. "The drugstore," Sarah said. 2 blocks east. They have a public telephone. It's not open until 7. The operator works all night. If I get to the telephone, I can reach the operator and she can connect me to the federal office in Charleston directly. Sarah was already moving toward the door. "I need 4 minutes to get there. Can you give me 4 minutes without Morrison noticing I'm gone?" Ruth grabbed her arm again. "If he catches you outside." "He's going to move us anyway, Ruth." Sarah said it flat and clear. "Whatever happens to me for going out that window is less than what happens to all of us if I don't." Ruth released her arm. She pressed the folded paper into Sarah's hand. "The number is on there. Agent's name is Walter Pruitt. He has a brother." "I know," Sarah said. The name hit her like cold water. Pruitt. The same name as Annie. Walter Pruitt was Annie's brother, and Bear Hawkins had known that had built this whole network around a brother who was trying to find the path to the man who had taken his sister. The whole shape of the last 2 years rearranged itself in her mind in a single second. "I know who he is. Who he are." She went out the laundry window for the second time, bag on her shoulder shawl, around her hitting the ground on her good leg first, the way she always did, and letting the momentum carry her into her stride without stopping, without adjusting, just moving. 4 blocks. She covered it in 6 minutes because her leg slowed her on the uneven morning street, and she did not curse it, and she did not apologize to herself for it. She just moved as fast as her body would move, and that was what it was. The drugstore was dark. The telephone booth on the corner next to it was lit from inside by its single bare bulb, the kind of light that looks like the loneliest thing in the world at 5 in the morning. She got in and lifted the receiver, and the operator answered in 2 rings, and Sarah gave her the number from the paper and said, "This is an emergency. Federal Labor Office in Charleston, Agent Walter Pruitt. Please connect me now." 20 seconds of clicking and dead air, and then a ring. Another. "Come on, come on." Pruitt. A man's voice. Alert immediately, no grogginess, the voice of someone who slept, ready to receive exactly this kind of call. "My name is Sarah Miller. I signed an affidavit for Bear Hawkins 4 days ago. I'm calling from Beckley. Morrison is moving to relocate the women in his establishment this morning, right now. If you don't have someone here today, there will be no one left to corroborate the affidavit." A pause. Brief. Then, "How many women?" 6, including me." "Is Bear Hawkins reachable?" "I don't know where he is. He filed the affidavit and I haven't heard from him since." "All right." She could hear him moving, the sound of a drawer, a chair, the particular sounds of a man shifting from stillness to action. "Miss Miller, I need you to do something very specific. Go back to that establishment. Do not let Morrison know you've made this call. If he starts to move any of the women before we arrive, you create any kind of delay. You can ask questions, claim you're sick, anything that buys time. We will be there." "How long?" A pause she didn't like. 2 hours, maybe less." 2 hours. Morrison was already in his shirt sleeves at 5 in the morning with a truck in the back alley. "I'll do what I can," she said. She hung up. She stood in the phone booth for 5 seconds with her hand still on the receiver, and she thought about Annie Pruitt, and she thought about Walter Pruitt, sleeping next to a telephone, waiting for it to ring. And she thought that grief was sometimes the thing that kept the right people awake at the right hours, and that her own particular losses had done the same thing for her, and that maybe that was what her mother had meant. Not that she was special, not that she was chosen, but that the things that had tried to break her had accidentally built something in her that could not be broken, and that this was the morning that thing got used for the purpose it was always meant for. She went back. Morrison was in the hallway when she came through the front door. She had gone around to the front deliberately because coming through the back would have told him exactly where she'd been, and coming through the front at 5:30 in the morning told him only that she'd been outside, which she could explain which she did before he could ask. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I went for air. My leg gets stiff if I lie too long." He looked at her. He looked at the door behind her. He looked at the bag on her shoulder, which she had kept because leaving it in the room would have required going back to the room before coming out, and she hadn't had the time. "Where were you going with the bag?" he said. "I wasn't going anywhere." She kept her voice easy. "I took it because my mother's Bible is in it. I carry it when I can't sleep. It settles me." She met his gaze with the same carefully calibrated expression she'd been wearing for 11 days. Not too steady, not too nervous. "I'm sorry if I worried you, Mr. Morrison." He looked at her for a long time. The longest he'd ever looked at her directly long enough that she felt the weight of it as something physical, the specific pressure of being seen by a man who is deciding whether what he's seeing is a threat. "Get your things together," he said finally. "All of them. I'm making some changes to the arrangements here. Better situation for everyone, another establishment I manage in Morgantown. Better facilities. Morgantown, 90 miles north, 90 miles away from Beckley and from Gerald Coombs and from Walter Pruitt, driving south from Charleston right now." "Of course," she said. "How much time do I have to get ready?" "An hour. 1 hour." Pruitt had said 2 hours, maybe less. She went to her room. She sat on the cot. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and she breathed and she thought fast and clear about every option she had. She could refuse, but refusal would tell Morrison everything, and he'd simply force the issue, and forcing would mean the others got moved faster, not slower. She could create the illness Pruitt had suggested, but that bought minutes, not an hour, because Morrison would call his men in from the truck and have her carried out, and that would be worse. What she needed was not delay. What she needed was the other women. She went to Ruth first. "Morgantown," she said at Ruth's door. Ruth closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "When 1 hour, I've made the call. They're coming, but it's 2 hours, maybe less." Ruth looked at the ceiling, then at Sarah. "If we all refuse together, he'll call his men in. Let him." Ruth's voice had changed. Something had come into it that had been gone for a long time. Something with edges. "There are 6 of us, and 3 of them, and if we make enough noise the entire street is going to hear it." Sarah looked at her. "You'd do that?" "I have been waiting 3 years for a reason to do that," Ruth said. "Go tell the others." Sarah went down the hall. She knocked on Vera's door first. "Morrison is moving everyone to Morgantown. There are federal agents coming, but not for another hour. We need to stay together, and we need to stay put. Can you hold?" Vera looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that had seen 14 months of this place. "Yes," she said. Just that. Clara's room. Clara opened the door, still coughing, her face thin and too pale, and Sarah felt a fierce protective anger rise up in her chest that she kept out of her voice. "Clara, we're staying put. All of us together. You don't have to do anything except stay in your room and don't open your door for Morrison. Can you do that?" Clara nodded. Her eyes were wet. "Is it really happening?" she whispered. "Is it really?" "It's really happening," Sarah said. Dottie's room. Dottie already had her door open a crack. She'd heard movement in the hallway. Sarah put her hand on the doorframe and looked at the girl and said, "You still have what you wrote under the mattress?" Dottie reached under the mattress and came up with a folded piece of paper. 4 months of added fees. Morrison's handwriting on the official slips. She'd saved dates and amounts and manufactured reasons. She held it out to Sarah. "Is this enough?" "It's perfect," Sarah said, and she meant it. Pauline was last, the corner woman. 22 months, the one who had looked at the middle distance so long she sometimes seemed to have gone somewhere inside herself that was safer than the room she was actually in. Sarah knocked, and Pauline opened the door and looked at her with those flat, distant eyes, and Sarah said, "I know you've been here the longest. I know what that means. But I need you to stay in this room and not open this door for anyone except me or Ruth. Not Morrison, not his men. Can you do that? Pauline looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved in those flat eyes. A small thing like a light from very far away. Like something that had been banked for a long time, catching the smallest possible breath of air. Yes, she said. Her voice was rusty from disuse. Yes, I can do that. Sarah went back to her own room, and she sat on the cot, and she put her mother's shawl around her shoulders, and she waited. Morrison came at the hour mark exactly. He knocked on her door and opened it without waiting and said, "Time to go." And she looked up at him from the cot and said, "I'm not feeling well enough to travel this morning." His face did the thing she'd been afraid of. The mask came down, not all the way, but far enough that she could see what was under it. The calculation. The decision being made in real time about how much trouble this was worth and how he was going to manage it. "That's not an option," he said. "I've made arrangements." "I understand," she said pleasantly, "and I'll be glad to go to Morgantown, Mr. Morrison. I just need another hour or two. My leg is bad this morning and I've been feeling feverish since I woke." She put a hand to her forehead. "If you have a doctor who could just come by and—" "There's no doctor necessary. I'm sure you're right." She looked at him with the calibrated expression, the compliant one, the one that said, "I trust your judgment," even as her hands were still on her knees and she was watching the clock in her head run. "I'm just concerned about traveling in this state. Your establishment in Morgantown, you'd want me arriving in good condition, wouldn't you?" The mask settled back into place. She could see him recalculating the trouble of forcing her now versus the trouble of waiting, the optics of dragging a sick woman into a truck, the additional time this cost him against the time he felt he had. He was still confident he had the better part of an hour before any official attention arrived. She needed him to stay confident. 45 minutes, he said. "Then we go, sick or not." He pulled the door closed. She heard him move down the hall to the other rooms, the same conversation repeated in variations, and then his voice sharpened at Vera's door. Vera had apparently said something he hadn't expected, and Sarah counted the exchange. The raised voice, the lower response, the silence. And she thought Vera is holding. They were all holding. 45 minutes. Pruitt had said 2 hours, maybe less. She had already used up most of 1 hour. The math was uncomfortable, and she sat with it because sitting with uncomfortable math was something she knew how to do. She heard the truck engine rev outside, one of Morrison's men repositioning it, getting ready. She heard Morrison on the telephone. His office was close enough to the hall that she could hear the tone of his voice, if not the words, and the tone was low and fast. And she caught one phrase through the wall, just 4 words before noon at latest. So someone else was involved. Someone on the other end of that call who had a deadline and a stake in this. Another establishment, or a contact, or someone who moved women between locations and needed things clean before any investigation could make the connection between here and wherever there was. She filed it. Noon. Another party. She pressed it into the part of her mind where everything important lived, and she held it there. 30 minutes passed, then 25. Then Morrison was in the hallway again, his voice raised now, no more pleasantness knocking on doors, hard telling them it was time, and she heard Dottie's voice from across the hall, small and frightened. And she heard Ruth saying something firm, and she heard Vera, and through it all, she sat on her cot, and she held the shawl, and she counted minutes and seconds, and she thought, come on, come on. The front door opened. Not Morrison, not his men. She heard it and she felt it in the change of the air in the building, the sudden stillness of everyone who had been making noise going quiet at once, the way birds go quiet when something large moves through. She was in the hallway in 4 seconds. Bear Hawkins stood inside the front door. Behind him, 2 men she didn't know in plain clothes with federal badges on their belts, and behind them coming up the front steps, a 3rd man with a briefcase, who moved like someone accustomed to arriving at places where they were not expected and were not welcome, and did not care about either. Morrison had come out of his office and was standing at the end of the hallway, and his face had the particular total stillness of a man watching everything he has built tip past the point of recovery. Bear looked down the hallway. He found Sarah's face, and something moved in his relief, she thought. And something more than relief, something that had been held tightly for 2 years and was now finally allowed to release. "Miss Miller," he said, "you all right?" "Yes," she said, "I'm all right." The man with the briefcase moved past Bear toward Morrison. "Mr. Jake Morrison, I'm Special Agent Walter Pruitt, Federal Labor Division. I have a warrant for the inspection of your business records and a federal complaint affidavit signed by a current resident of this establishment, alleging violations of the Federal Labor Code and involuntary servitude statutes." He held out a document. "I'll need your ledger books, all of them." Morrison didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Sarah. Not with anger, she had expected anger. What she hadn't expected was the exact expression she saw: recognition. The particular terrible recognition of a man who has badly underestimated something and is only now understanding what it was. She looked back at him steadily. She did not look away. She did not perform anything, not triumph, not coldness, not satisfaction. She just looked at him the way she had been looking at difficult things her whole life. Directly, without flinching, seeing exactly what was there. Morrison's hand came up, and he gave Walter Pruitt the office key. Just like that. No fight, no argument. The hand coming up, the key coming off the ring, and the particular sound of a man's whole constructed world collapsing without even the dignity of a noise. Bear came down the hallway and stopped in front of Sarah and looked at her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before and did not have an immediate name for. It was the look of a man who is seeing what something actually is when given the chance to see it clearly. Not adjusted, not recalibrated, just seen. "How'd you hold them?" he asked. "All of them together, how?" Sarah looked at the doors along the hallway. Ruth's, Vera's, Clara's, Dottie's, Pauline's. 5 women who had stayed when they could have scattered, who had held together under pressure, with nothing to anchor them except the word of a woman they'd known less than 2 weeks. She thought about what it had taken, and she thought it was not a complicated answer. "I told them the truth," she said. "People hold when you tell them the truth." Bear nodded. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a folded paper and held it out to her. She took it and opened it. It was a receipt. $75 paid to the Morrison Employment and Boarding Establishment on behalf of Sarah Miller, marked "full satisfaction of debt and release of all obligations." She stared at it. "That's not—" She looked up. "That's not how this works. The affidavit, the investigation, my balance should be void," Bear said. "It will be. That paper just makes it happen today instead of in 6 weeks when the legal process finishes." He paused. "The 75 covers your balance and all the manufactured additions. It was the fastest way to make your release legal and uncontestable right now before Morrison could claim anything further." Another pause. "It's my money. I don't want it back. Before you say anything about that." She looked at the receipt in her hands. $75. A number that meant nothing except that it was a wall someone had demolished on her behalf. Not because she couldn't have demolished it herself eventually through the legal process already in motion, but because he had seen that she had been waiting long enough. She folded the receipt. She held it in her hand. "The others," she said. "Their balances. The investigation will void all of it. Pruitt has everything he needs." He looked at her steadily. "This is done, Sarah. What Morrison built here, it's done." Down the hall, Walter Pruitt was coming out of Morrison's office with the first ledger under his arm, and Morrison was being walked to the front of the building by one of the other agents, and Ruth was standing in her doorway with her arms crossed and her face doing that complicated multiple emotion thing. And Dottie had come out of her room and was standing in the hallway with her folded paper of dates and fees held tight in both hands, and Clara was at her door, and Vera and Pauline, who had been here 22 months, and had looked at the middle distance so long, was standing in her doorway, looking at Bear Hawkins and the federal badges and the ledger coming out from under Morrison's lock, with an expression that was entirely, completely, undeniably present. Not the middle distance, right here, right now. Sarah looked at all of them, and she felt something move through her that she didn't try to name, because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. She just let it move through her and held her mother's shawl against her ribs with one arm, and the receipt in her other hand, and she stood in the hallway of the place that had held all of them, and she let herself be exactly where she was. Bear was still beside her. She was aware of his presence the way you are aware of something solid when you have been standing on uncertain ground. Not dramatic, not consuming, just there. Substantial. Real. "What happens now?" she asked. Not to him specifically. To the air. To the morning. But he answered anyway. "That," he said quietly, "is entirely up to you." She looked at the front door. Outside, through the glass, the morning had arrived fully. Not the gray pre-dawn of 3 hours ago, but real morning, the kind that doesn't ask permission. She looked at the door, and she thought about Render Hollow, and her father's porch, and the crumbling cabin, and the $2, and the cornmeal stretched since Tuesday, and 25 years of holding things inside where no one could reach them. She thought about her mother's voice. "You are not what they say you are." She tightened her grip on the shawl. On the receipt, on the specific, fragile, indestructible thing that had carried her through every night in this building, and through 6 days of careful waiting, and through a 4-block walk in the dark, and a phone call at 5 in the morning, and 45 minutes on a cot, listening to a truck idle out back. She was not what they said she was. She was about to show them what she actually was, and she already knew exactly where she intended to start. The first thing Sarah did when she walked out of Morrison's building was stop on the sidewalk and stand still for 30 seconds. Not because she didn't know where to go. Not because she was overwhelmed, though she was, in the way that a dam is overwhelmed when the pressure finally equalizes, not broken, just finally allowed to move. She stopped because she needed to feel the ground under her feet, without a locked door behind her. She needed one full breath that belonged entirely to herself. She took it. Then she moved. Bear was beside her when she started walking, matching her pace without comment, without adjusting the way he always seemed to move around her present, without crowding close, without presuming. Behind them, Walter Pruitt and his men were still inside with the ledgers. Ruth was with them, talking in the low, precise voice of a woman who has been storing testimony for 3 years and is finally in front of the right ears. Dottie had given Pruitt her folded paper of dates and fees with both hands, and Pruitt had looked at it and then at her and said very quietly, "This is excellent work, miss." And Dottie had started crying in the particular helpless way of someone who has been holding their breath for 4 months and has just been given permission to breathe. Sarah had watched that and felt something crack open in her chest that was entirely different from the cracking of the morning her father closed his fist around $2. This crack let light in. "Where are you going?" Bear asked her. She thought about it honestly. She had $75 released from Morrison's debt, which was Bear's money, which she intended to repay, and the clothes on her back, and a cloth bag with a Bible and a photograph and a comb and her mother's shawl around her shoulders in the summer heat. She had no home, no family who would call themselves that, no job and no address and no plan beyond the one that had just finished executing. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going there myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My cabin is on Flat Top Mountain, about 40 minutes north. It's not much a working cabin, nothing fine about it. But it's got a spare room and more space than one person needs, and I make decent coffee." He kept his eyes forward, not at her, which she understood was deliberate. He was offering without pressing, stating a fact and letting her receive it or not on her own terms. "You could think from there. Figure out the next thing without having to figure out the next thing and where you're sleeping at the same time." She looked at the side of his face. The honest, weathered quality of it. The jaw that was set not in hardness, but in the specific steadiness of a man who had decided a long time ago what kind of person he was going to be, and had been being it ever since, quietly without audience up on a mountain by himself, with no one to perform it for. "Your coffee," she said. "Is it actually decent, or are you being modest?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Ruth says it's the best in Raleigh County." Ruth also worked for Morrison for 3 years, and her judgment has been operating in a constrained environment, Sarah said. "I'll reserve opinion." This time it was a real smile. Brief, unpracticed, the kind that arrived without permission. "Fair enough," he said. She looked forward. I'll come. For now. While I figure out the next thing. She paused. I want to be clear about what that means. It means I'm a person making a practical decision about shelter, not a woman who needs to be taken care of. I know what it means, Bear said. I wouldn't have offered it any other way. She believed him. She couldn't have explained in logical, sequential terms exactly why she believed him, except that she had been reading people her whole life out of absolute necessity, and Bear Hawkins read true every single time she looked. They went back inside to tell Pruitt where Sarah would be reachable and to check on the others. The others. That was the thing that stopped her moving toward the door and turned her back around because she could not leave without knowing what happened to them. She found Ruth in the kitchen, standing with Pruitt and his agent, and she waited until there was a pause, and then she said, "The other women. Vera Dottie, Clara Pauline. What happens to them right now? Today?" Pruitt looked at her. He had a face that was younger than his position suggested, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much of what people did to each other and had chosen consciously not to become cold about it. "Morrison's business is frozen as of this morning. He will not be operating in any capacity. The women here are free to leave. Their debts are legally void. I'll have paperwork confirming that to each of them before noon." He paused. "Those who have nowhere to go, we have arrangements with a legitimate boarding house 2 blocks from here. Clean free for 60 days while they get their bearings." "Pauline has been here 22 months, Sarah said. "She's going to need more than 60 days to find her bearings." "I know." Pruitt said it without defensiveness. "I'll make sure she's not forgotten." Sarah looked at him. "Your sister's name was Annie," she said. The room went very quiet. Pruitt's face did something complex and private and then settled. "Yes," he said. "She was 16. I know. I'm sorry." She held his gaze. "She's part of why this happened today. I think you should know that her name mattered. It kept Bear Hawkins working when it would have been easier to stop, and it kept the line open that I needed this morning." She paused. "She mattered. She still matters." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. He nodded once, the nod of a man absorbing something that costs him to receive. "Thank you," he said, "for saying that." She went to find the others. Vera was in her room, sitting on her cot with her hands flat on her knees, the same position Sarah had been in 100 times in the past 11 days. She looked up when Sarah appeared in the doorway and said without preamble, "Is it actually over?" "Morrison is in federal custody," Sarah said. "Your debt is void. You can walk out that front door right now and no one will stop you." Vera looked at the front door that was visible from her room if she angled her head. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been told exists but have not yet been able to fully believe in, cautious measuring, not quite ready to trust what they're seeing. "Where do I go?" she said. "There's a legitimate boarding house 2 blocks from here. 60 days free. Pruitt arranged it." Sarah came into the room and sat beside her the same way she'd sat beside Dottie 9 days ago, close enough to be present without crowding. "After that, I don't know. But after that, you're a free woman, with 60 days of sleep and meals behind her, and a federal document voiding everything Morrison ever put your name on. You figure it out from there." Vera looked at her hands. "I had a sister in Huntington," she said slowly. "Before Morrison. We had a falling out over something stupid. I haven't talked to her in 2 years." She was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking if I called her from in here, it would mean she was right about things she wasn't actually right about." "Call her," Sarah said. "Being right about what matters is not the same thing as being right about everything." Vera looked at her sidelong, a long look. Then she stood up, picked up her small bag from under the cot, and walked out of the room without another word. And Sarah heard her go down the hallway and out the front door, and the sound of it. That one pair of footsteps going freely out a door that had been locked at 10 o'clock for 14 months was one of the best sounds she had ever heard in her life. Clara was harder. Clara was sitting on her cot coughing when Sarah came in, and Sarah sat beside her and waited until the coughing passed and then said, "You need a doctor, a real one, not Morrison's arrangement." "I don't have money for a doctor," Clara said. Pruitt's office has a fund for women leaving exploitative labor situations. I'll make sure he knows you need medical attention before anything else." Sarah put her hand over Clara's. "You're not going to handle this alone. I promise you that." Clara looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and said, "You've only been here 11 days. Why do you care so much?" Sarah thought about it honestly. "Because you coughed through my wall every night for 11 days, she said. "And every time I heard it, I thought about what it meant that no one in this place was allowed to get you help, and I decided that was going to stop." She squeezed Clara's hand once. It stopped. Dottie she found in the hallway, already talking to one of Pruitt's agents, her folded paper in the agent's hands, now her chin up in a way it hadn't been since the first morning at the breakfast table. The girl who couldn't look up from her coffee cup was standing in the hallway of Morrison's building, explaining clearly and in order every manufactured fee that had been added to her balance over 4 months, and the agent was writing it all down, and Dottie's voice only shook twice. Sarah watched her from the end of the hallway. She did not interrupt. Pauline was the last. Pauline was standing in her doorway when Sarah came down the hall, and she was holding a small photograph worn creased across the middle, clearly handled many times, and she was looking at it with those eyes that were no longer distant, that were entirely terrifyingly present now in a way that seemed to be costing her something. "Who is that?" Sarah asked gently. "My daughter," Pauline said. "She's 4. She was 2 when I came here." Her voice was flat in the way of someone reciting something they can't afford to feel fully yet. "Her grandmother has her. My mother." She looked up. "Do you think she'll remember me?" Sarah looked at the photograph. A small face, bright eyes caught mid-laugh at something outside the frame. "She's 4, Sarah said. 4-year-olds remember everything that matters to them." She paused. "Go find out." Pauline pressed the photograph against her chest, the same way Sarah pressed her mother's shawl. 22 months of a corner and a middle distance, and a balance that never moved, and a daughter growing up without her. She pressed the photograph against her chest, and she breathed. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." The most loaded word in the language, the word that means, "I am going to try." Okay. Sarah drove north with Bear in his truck an hour later, her bag on her lap, and her shawl across her shoulders, and the summer mountains rising around them on both sides. She did not look back at Beckley as they left it. She had a rule about that. They drove in silence for a while, the good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Bear drove the way he did everything, with a steady, deliberate quality. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. She watched the road and felt the motion of the truck and let herself for the first time in 11 days not be planning anything. Just existing. Just moving through space in a direction that was chosen and not forced. After about 15 minutes, he said, "You're going to want to know about Annie." She looked at him. "Tell me." He kept his eyes on the road. She was Walter's youngest sister, 16. Their mother had died the year before, and their father drank same story as 100 others. Morrison got to her through a woman who came recruiting through Logan County, told her there was work in Beckley, good honest work, a wage and a room. He paused. By the time Walter figured out where she was, Morrison had moved her. We never found where. Another pause longer. That was 2 years and 3 months ago. Walter is still looking. Sarah felt the weight of it settle in the truck between them. "Is there a real chance of finding her?" "There's always a real chance," Bear said, "as long as you're still looking." He said it the way he said most things, plain and without decoration, which made it land harder than comfort would have. What Morrison had today, the ledger, the names, the network of people he was moving women to Walter, now has all of that. Every contact, every location. If Annie is in one of those systems, she's findable. Sarah held that. She turned it over the way she turned over everything important, examining the structure of it, the places where it was solid, and the places where it was only possible, and the difference between those two things. "I want to help with that," she said. Bear glanced at her. "With finding Annie, with all of it, the whole system." She looked forward at the road. "What Morrison had here, it's not just Beckley, you know that. The men he was calling the other establishments, the network of people who move women between locations. Today stopped one node. It didn't stop the network. She paused. I know what these places look like from the inside. I know how the debt system works, how the ledgers are structured, what the language sounds like, how the women inside them think, and what they need to hear to trust that something is real. She looked at him. That's useful. That's the kind of thing Walter Pruitt's office doesn't have. Bear was quiet for a moment. The truck climbed the road, narrowing and steepening, as the mountain rose around them. You just got out of one of those places 11 days in, he said carefully. Most people would want some distance before they went back near anything like it. I'm not most people, she said. He considered that. She waited, letting him consider not pressing. No, he said finally. You're not. They reached the cabin as the morning was tipping toward midday, and it was exactly what he'd said. A working cabin. Nothing fine about it. Solid and plain. And built by someone who understood that a structure's job is to hold and protect what is inside it. She got out of the truck and stood in front of it, and felt the mountain air, which was different from the valley air, cooler and cleaner, and carrying the smell of the hardwoods instead of coal dust and summer pavement. She did not perform any emotion about arriving. She just looked at it and took it in and said, "Show me around." He showed her around. The spare room was small and had a window that looked east, which meant morning light, which she decided immediately was important to her. The kitchen was functional and had a good wood stove and a table with 2 chairs. He had books more than she expected stacked on shelves he'd built himself, and she ran her eyes along the spines while he put the coffee on and felt something open up in her chest again, the same crack-letting light-in feeling. A man with books, real ones, red ones with the spines cracked, was a man who had a whole interior life and had been tending it alone up here, and that mattered to her in a way she didn't immediately examine. He put 2 cups on the table, and she sat down, and he sat across from her, and she picked up the coffee and drank it and held his gaze over the rim of the cup. "Well," he said. "It's good," she said. "Better than decent. Considerably." She set the cup down. "Don't get proud about it." The corner of his mouth moved again. She was starting to understand that this was what passed for a full smile from Bear Hawkins, and that it was enough, it was exactly enough, because it was real. They talked for a long time at that table. About Morrison's case and what Pruitt would need going forward. About the network Bear had been mapping for 2 years, the names, the towns, the patterns of how women were moved and why. She asked questions, and he answered them, and she asked more questions, and he answered those too, and at some point the coffee was gone, and neither of them moved to get more, because the conversation was moving, and stopping it for coffee would have been the wrong choice. She told him about Ruth, about how Ruth had been inside Morrison's operation for 3 years, not as a willing participant, but as a woman trapped by the same system she helped administer, and that Ruth had spent those 3 years keeping a telephone number under a washstand base and waiting for someone to give her enough to use it. Ruth knows how these places recruit, Sarah said. She knows the language they use, the women they target, the way they make it sound like opportunity. She'd be valuable, not just as a witness, but as someone who could help identify recruitment patterns before women end up in these situations in the first place. Bear looked at her steadily. "You've been thinking about this since the hallway this morning." "I've been thinking about this since the first night," she said. "I had a lot of time to think." He leaned back in his chair. "What you're describing, working with Pruitt's office, using your experience to help identify other situations, building something that functions as an early warning system." He paused. "That's not a small thing. That's a sustained commitment. Months, maybe years. I know. And you want to do it from here. From this mountain." She looked at the table, at the coffee cup, at the 2 chairs that had been one man's furniture, and were now already starting to feel like 2 people's furniture, in a way that wasn't about ownership or designation, but about presence. She looked at his hands on the table, large and still, and work-worn, the hands of a man who had been doing hard things alone for a long time. "I want to do it from wherever it makes sense to do it from," she said honestly. "Right now that's here, Tomorrow it might be a county office in Beckley or a boarding house in Logan or the back of your truck driving toward wherever the next one is. She met his eyes. I'm not a woman who needs a fixed point, Bear. I'm a woman who needs a purpose. Those are different things. He looked at her for a long time. The reading look. The one that didn't recalibrate or revise, that just looked. You know, he said quietly. I came into Beckley that first evening because I needed a part for the truck. I wasn't there because of Morrison. I wasn't there because of the case. I was there because the hardware store on Depot Street carries a specific belt I can't get anywhere else. He paused. I almost didn't stop when I saw you. I thought, it's not my business. I don't have enough information. I don't want to make it worse by blundering in. He looked at the table. I'm glad I stopped. Sarah looked at him. She felt the words land in the same place where his words always landed, somewhere real. Somewhere that didn't perform anything in response, but simply received. I'm glad too, she said. And then, because she was a woman who had spent 25 years saying exactly as much as was true and no more, I'm very glad. 3 months later, Jake Morrison stood in a federal courtroom in Charleston and listened to the charges read against him. 11 counts, covering involuntary servitude, fraudulent labor, contracting, and conspiracy. And he listened to the testimony delivered by 6 women who had lived in his building, and he listened to the financial analysis of his ledgers that showed in the clear language of numbers exactly how the debt system had been constructed to ensure it could never be discharged. And his face throughout the entire proceeding had the compressed, shuttered quality of a man who has discovered too late that the women he believed he owned had been watching him far more carefully than he had ever watched them. Vera testified from Huntington, where she had called her sister and been on the phone for 2 hours, and then driven there, and been on the sister's porch for another hour, before they said anything to each other except the other person's name. She delivered her testimony in a clear, steady voice, and returned to Huntington the same afternoon. Clara testified from a chair, because standing for long periods was still hard, but her voice was stronger than it had been 3 months of a real doctor and real medication having done what they do when they're actually applied to a problem. She looked at Morrison across the courtroom, and she did not look away. Dottie testified last among the 5. She was 18 now, which she pointed out at the beginning of her statement, 18 and here by her own choice with her own document in her own hand, and she wanted the record to reflect that. The judge said it would. She sat down with the particular shoulders-back quality of someone who has found out what they're made of and intends to keep using it. Ruth had been offered immunity for her cooperation and had been working with Pruitt's office for 3 months as a consultant on the recruitment patterns she'd observed. She had not testified in the criminal trial. Her role was in the broader investigation, but she was in the courtroom when the verdict came, sitting in the gallery 3 rows back. And when the foreman said guilty on all 11 counts, she made a sound that was not quite a word, low and private. The sound of something finally being set down after a very long time of carrying it. Sarah was beside her. Morrison was sentenced to 12 years. The sentence was read, and the courtroom did what courtrooms do. Shifted, murmured, reorganized itself around the new fact, and Sarah sat with it and let herself feel for a full minute. Everything she hadn't let herself feel in the days when feeling it would have cost her the steadiness she needed. She felt the 2 coins dropped on a table. She felt the bolt at 10 o'clock. She felt 6 nights of not sleeping and a 4-block walk in the dark, and a telephone operator saying, "Please hold," and the sound of a truck engine idling out back while she counted minutes on a cot. She felt her mother's voice pressed into her ear 3 years ago, like something meant to survive the person who spoke it. You are not what they say you are. She let herself feel all of it for 60 full seconds. Then she stood up. Bear was waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom doors. He looked up when she came through, and he looked at her face, and whatever he read there made him nod once, the same kind of nod as always, the one that said, "I understand," without requiring her to perform anything more than what she'd already shown him. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. They walked out of the federal building into the Charleston afternoon, and she put the shawl across her arm because the day had turned warm, and she walked beside him on the courthouse steps, with her rolling, effortful gait that cost more per step than other people's gait cost them, and always had, and always would, and she did not give it a single thought except to be grateful, as she had occasionally allowed herself to be over these past 3 months. That her body had carried her through everything it had been asked to carry her through, and was still here, still moving, still capable of climbing courthouse steps in the sun. In the weeks that followed, she and Bear drove to 3 other towns with Pruitt's office. She sat across from women in bad situations, and she did not tell them what to feel or what to do. She told them the truth, what was real and what was possible, and what it actually cost, and what it actually gave back. She told them the truth the way she had told the women in Morrison's hallway the truth, because she had learned 11 days in a locked building that truth was the only thing that held. She told them about her mother's shawl, about the $2, about the bolt at 10 o'clock, and the laundry room window, and the telephone booth, and the man who had put his hat back on his head with the deliberateness of a decision. She told them these things not to make herself the story, but to make them understand that the story could be survived, and that surviving it was not the same as being unharmed by it, and that being harmed and being broken were entirely different things. Some of the women she sat across from were ready to hear it. Some were not. She treated both kinds with the same steady patience, the patience of a woman who understood that being ready is not a choice, that it comes when it comes, and that what a person needs in the meantime is someone willing to wait. Bear always waited in the truck. He always had coffee when she came back. He always asked on the drive home not how it had gone, he could read that from her face, but what she needed when they got back to the mountain. Sometimes it was to talk. Sometimes it was to sit at the table with the books and say nothing. He had learned with the same deliberate attentiveness he brought to everything which was which. In October, 3 months after the verdict, she was sitting at the table reading when he came in from outside and set something on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It was a key. "Spare key to the cabin," he said. "I had it made in Beckley last week." He did not make anything of it, did not frame it, did not color it with anything beyond what it was. Just set it down. A key to a door. An offer of the specific kind of permanence that is not ownership, but belonging. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about everything a key meant, and everything it didn't mean, and everything she had never had before, and everything she was now entirely capable of deciding for herself. She picked it up. The weight of it was small and specific and real. "Thank you," she said. He sat down across from her, picked up his own book, opened it to his page. She looked at him for a moment, the honest face, the reading glasses she'd discovered he needed, and resisted wearing in her presence until she told him flatly they were fine, and he'd worn them every evening since the large hands that were equally capable of physical labor and of setting a cup of coffee in front of her with the particular care of a man who notices what other people need before they ask. She looked at all of it and felt the specific, unperformed, undramatic thing she had been feeling for months now settle into something with a name. She opened her book. They sat in the October evening and read, and outside the mountain did what mountains do, held everything inside it steady against the weather, unchanged by seasons, permanent in all the ways that mattered. A woman sold for $2 did not become a symbol. She became something more specific and more real than that. She became a woman who knew her own worth so precisely and so completely that no one who came after her could put a number on it, because she would look at them with those eyes, the ones Morrison had never thought to assess, and they would understand immediately that they had already made their first and most significant mistake. A man who had lived alone on a mountain for years did not become a hero. He became something quieter and more durable. A man who had looked at a woman the world had underestimated, seen exactly what she was, and then spent the rest of his life making sure she had the space and the ground and the truth-telling company she needed to become the fullest possible version of it. And the broken thing, the system, the debt, the locked doors at 10 o'clock did not disappear. These things do not disappear. But it was smaller than it had been, and getting smaller because 2 people on a mountain and 5 women who had walked out of a building into a morning they had not been sure they would see were all in their various ways working on it. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was in fact exactly what the world is made of. Not grand gestures and singular heroes, but people who decide quietly and without audience that the truth matters, and that the people who have been told they do not matter are wrong, and that someone is going to have to say so, and it might as well be them. Sarah Miller had been sold for $2 on a summer morning in 1954. She spent the rest of her life proving that the only price that had ever been accurate was the one her mother set pressed into her ear, in the last good breath of a dying woman who knew exactly what she was leaving behind. Not nothing, not a burden, not a cripple, not a problem to be arranged away for the cost of $1 and a handful of coins. A daughter worth everything. And she was right, and